Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. Peter Salmon is back today, the author of the biography about Derrida called An Event Perhaps. And we talked last time about basically about how public intellectuals, like people of the so-called intellectual dark web, like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and people like that, and like the new book Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, for example, they get so-called postmodernism totally wrong and link it to Marxism and have all of these claims that they make all these claims that uh, so-called postmodernists like Derrida and Foucault supposedly said things like that there is no truth and they want to bring down Western civilization and stuff like that, which is nothing even close to what they were actually talking about if you actually read what they were saying in their books. And you had mentioned when we were talking in that first episode that you're a big fan of Husserl and his thoughts on phenomenology, and he basically invented the philosophical field of phenomenology. So
Yeah.
I'm excited to get into that, and like I put up on the screen here, and like I was saying, I kind of took down some notes of the what seemed like important aspects of it, or just really interesting aspects of it too. So to start off with, like, I guess, how did you get interested in Husserl in the first place, and what interests you most about him? Is it phenomenology, and if so, like, what specifically about phenomenology?
Yeah, sure. The first thing to say is that I don't claim to be an expert on Husserl. He,
Oh yeah.
but I am an expert on being incredibly enthusiastic about Husserl. I've bored a lot of people, and I'm prepared to bore some more people tonight about Husserl, who I think is an astonishing thinker. He is very well known in continental philosophy, particularly. And when I say continental philosophy, I'm not just talking about continental in the big C style, but on the continent. I mean, a whole generation of particularly French and German thinkers were brought up on Husserl. You basically, if you're a French thinker of the 50s, 60s, 70s, you either have to go with Husserl or against Husserl. Whereas in the Anglophone countries, he's less well known. He's often just seen as a precursor to Heidegger. Heidegger was one of his students, and was kind of
I
seen.
forgot that.
Yeah,
I'm a little bit familiar with Heidegger. He's a really interesting
he
philosopher
is.
too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we'll get onto him for both intellectual and personal reasons. But so Husserl is this amazingly influential thinker, and the reason I came to him was in writing the biography of Derrida. Um, I was struggling. To be honest, I was really struggling with the book for a long time. I had kind of the view of Derrida that most people have, who have done a little bit of Derrida, who have seen him in the popular culture and so forth, where he's kind of this mad new way of doing philosophy and this difficult and strange thinker, and he is all of those things, but. I really felt at one point I had to try and ground him as a philosopher. I had to try and remember that he was a philosopher doing philosophy and try and look at where he started. And for the first sort of 15 years of his philosophical career as a teacher, lecturer, and so forth, before the great 1967 years of fame and onwards, um, he was working on Husserl. He spent about 15 years working on Husserl in various different ways. His first book was a translation of Husserl, was a translation of Husserl's Origin of Geometry. The Origin of Geometry is about 15 pages long. The introduction that Derrida wrote is about 150 pages long, which is very, very
Wow.
Derrida.
Yeah.
And so there's this hugely influential thinker for Derrida. And the more I read of Husserl, the more I just came to love his work. In sort of an almost protective sense. He's very. I describe him in my book several times as grappling. He grapples with big ideas and really thinks through ideas. Whenever you're reading Husserl and you think of an objection, 2 or 3 pages later, he's also talking about that objection. He's trying to work things out. And he just had this tremendous influence by doing that, but also had a slightly tragic life in many ways, particularly the end of it, which we'll get to at the end. But basically, he was born in 1859. He started off in mathematics, in fact, in astronomy, and then graduated into mathematics. And what I didn't know, and I continue to sort of find this amazing, was there was a huge crisis in mathematics in the late 19th century. Basically, certain things had occurred which made it look like the system wasn't working. That, in a very basic sense, some of the fundamental things about mathematics were not working, were being proved wrong. And for a lot of mathematicians, this was a terrible, desperate, and difficult time. People like Frege, slightly later Bertrand Russell, but also for Husserl. And Husserl's first book was the philosophy of arithmetic, and was basically one of those books which you hear about when you haven't done philosophy, but you think they're going to be like this, where he spends 100 pages trying to prove what the number 7 is, for instance. Trying to work out what actually that is. But for him, the fundamental problem, the fundamental difficulty, and it would remain the fundamental difficulty throughout his life, and it's a problem all philosophers have tackled in one way or another, is how consciousness, what's going on inside, relates to the world, what's going on outside. He describes this strange relationship between the two. And he was really trying to work out that as a mathematician originally. And it's the old philosophical problem. Again, Philosophy 101, does 2 + 2 = 4 if there's no minds in the world? Does 2 + 2 = 4 in another universe? Does it equal 4 on the moon? Do numbers exist? And all of those things. If you have two objects, do they become two if there is no human there to decide that they're two? So that's kind of where he starts from before moving into philosophy, and kind of where I start from in encountering him.
Okay, that's that's interesting. That's a subject of like, in terms of whether 2 + 2 = 4 if a human is not there to witness it is interesting too. And it kind of I kind of think about subjects like that in terms of post-structuralist philosophers like Derrida and Foucault, like we probably talked about a little bit before, like in terms of truth and science and different types of truth. And like, are numbers like, is math actually a thing that exists in the universe? Is the universe actually constructed of math out there in the far reaches of space that no humans have ever been to? Are there actually like mathematical numbers that govern the universe that way? It's really hard to say. It's like being interested in thinkers like these has made me more convinced that this is maybe the universe operates mathematically, so that's like a useful way to look at the universe. Like, the universe operates based on this premise, such as that 2 + 2 = 4, but we invented these concepts of math and numbers and 2 and 4 and all of these separate numbers.
Yeah, which is fascinating stuff, isn't it? I mean, there's thinkers like Thomas Kuhn in the 50s and 60s who are looking at the idea of paradigm shifts, where a mathematical system or a scientific system isn't necessarily truer than the one that it's before. It just has better results, as it were, and the contradictions of the other one make it collapse. So, I mean, this is the stuff that the mathematicians are grappling with in the late 19th century. The big shift for Husserl was he started attending some lectures by a guy called Brentano. And Brentano had a fundamental insight. Wrote a lot, but had one sentence really that kind of really kicked home. And he was looking at consciousness, and as I'm sure many of us know, Descartes has this idea of the ghost in the machine. This consciousness that's inside us, and it bubbles away, and you can doubt everything else, but you get back to the consciousness. And it kind of has this sort of kind of like it's just an object in us somewhere. The subject is this object. Brentano came up with the notion of intentionality, and intentionality says that all consciousness is consciousness of something. You can't have empty consciousness. So consciousness is of a table, or of a house, or of a concept, or of the moon, or of hunger, all of these things. So consciousness is always consciousness of something, and this then engages with the world. So and this was a really striking idea for Husserl. Husserl suddenly was looking at this and thinking, okay, so suddenly the world is created in some sense by consciousness, or to take it even a step further, and this is something that Husserl did grapple with, that the world creates consciousness, that there is no subject without world, as it were. And for Husserl, this took him into philosophy, and gave him a possible way forward with mathematics, that somehow there was a coherence between consciousness and mathematics, that understanding the world was a consciousness of these things, whether they be numbers or whether they be tables or any of those things. And so he looked at this for a long time, and he kept finding himself kind of caught in this corner that many philosophers have been caught up in, which is, again, philosophy 101, does the world exist? And I'm sure everyone's familiar with the kind of separation between idealism, which says that it's all in our heads, that you can't actually prove the world exists, or realism, which says, yeah, it's there, basically, to traduce both traditions terribly.
Maybe it'd be good to go over the three sort of different perspectives in philosophy of mind, like idealism, materialism, and dualism.
Yeah. Okay. Well, idealism. Let's start with dualism. Okay, so dualism is where Descartes comes in. Basically, there is a mind, there is body, and mysteriously they're related, but they are very separate things. So and it's almost a Christian idea, isn't it, or a religious idea anyway, that you have a soul and it's trapped within the body, and the body dies, the soul goes off and does whatever it wants to do. And it's very much, I always think of it as a metaphor like a lighthouse, that you have this consciousness in there, and it shoots out and gathers the world, but it's in here somehow. Descartes was, played a bit fast and loose as how it's in there, and in fact, we all have to play a bit fast and loose, because even for every philosophical stripe, it's very hard to explain how the mind does what it does, how the brain turns into mind. So that's one position. Idealism takes that to its logical conclusion, that if consciousness is the only thing we can be sure of, can we be sure of anything in the world? We can be fooled by the world. We can be fooled by dreams. We can see something we think is a hat and it turns out to be something else. The world is constantly fooling us. One possible explanation is there is no world. I'm the only person who exists. No one else exists. They're all figments of my imagination. This computer doesn't exist. Literally nothing else exists. I could be a consciousness in a vat somewhere. And it's actually incredibly hard to argue that that's wrong. But
yeah,
I think basically everyone likes to think it's wrong, and therefore it hasn't been fully embraced. No one's actually gone the whole way of saying, yes, you are a brain in a vat, or I guess they would have to say, I am a brain in a vat.
That's such a like a nerdy thing to get into, that kind of brings together two main interests of mine, like science fiction and fantasy novels and movies and TV shows, and philosophy. Like The Matrix is a famous example of basically what Descartes was talking about in terms of consciousness. And was it him who talked about the brain in the vat specifically?
No, it's not. No,
I forget who it was. Who is that?
Well, there's Gilbert Ryle came up with the idea.
Yeah, it was Ryle. Yeah, I remember hearing about that. It could be a lot of people are talking about this nowadays. It could easily be the case that supposedly sometime in the very near future we could create virtual realities that are so convincingly realistic that they're indistinguishable from reality. And then if that were the case, how would you know the difference between virtual reality and the real world? And that's obviously a theme that's been explored in tons of science fiction, because it's such a fascinating idea, and because it's so possible. That's another thing that another area that my mind was changed on when I started learning more about philosophy, and more specifically about some of these continental thinkers like Husserl and Heidegger and Derrida and Foucault, etc. Like the is that like are we actually, does it make sense to be like an eliminative materialist and think that everything is physical? Like how do we like that? I've even heard a few physicists say this lately, like absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, contrary to what people might say. Like we have no idea what's really going on there. It could be anything going on. It could be exactly the way materialists think it is. It could be something totally different. Like I'm far from the first person to point this out, but like we're supposed and I am biased toward believing this anyway for some reason, because I guess I'm kind of like inherently trust science to a degree, because like for example I got the COVID vaccinations even though I probably didn't research them as much as I should have, and I'm inclined to agree with physicists who say that, you know, supposedly the Big Bang Theory states that about 14 billion years ago the universe basically emerged into existence. And then there are all these arguments even among physicists of like, was there actually a beginning of the universe? Was there actually a beginning and end? Is it infinite? Is it limited? Like there are lots of different mathematical theories that have been talked about in terms of this, that Husserl kind of like he kind of like pioneered some of the, especially some of the philosophical thinking in terms of those subjects, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Yep. And I mean, what is fascinating about Husserl, if we just pause there for a moment, is that he for me, the other reason I'm fascinated by him is he's kind of at that point before analytic and continental philosophy go their separate ways. He would be astonished by that split. He worked so closely with both of those traditions, virtually invented one of those traditions, but it was through looking at analytical stuff. But just to go back a step, I mean, it is a fascinating time, isn't it, with the notions of avatars and CGI and all of these things, where this false reality is becoming more and more pervasive and more acceptable, as it were. I don't know if you've seen, there's a new documentary on the chef Anthony Bourdain came out recently. Some of your watches my nose. There's a whole controversy about it because at one stage there was a section where they used a CGI type voice of Bourdain because they couldn't find something that they wanted him to say. Now the entire rest of the movie is him talking normally, but it's just kind of dubbed basically.
Okay. Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah. I haven't seen the documentary, but I heard that someone used a deep fake in that.
Yeah,
and I'm a fan of his. I've seen some of his older documentary series, and I read his original book, Kitchen Confidential, which I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're at a point now where we will say there's deep fake in it. That's very controversial. It's possible in 10 years' time it just wouldn't even be mentioned. It would just be accepted that, you know, deep fake is part of our way of dealing with the world. So that's all interesting stuff. But of course, when we're talking about this with idealism and the world is fake and all that sort of stuff, that's obviously the hard version of idealism. But believe the world exists, but still be an idealist in the sense that we were talking about before. If I think all mathematical concepts are constructions of the human mind, that's different to someone who thinks that they're constructions of the world. So to say that is an idealistic is idealism. It's always say idealistic because that's got other connotations. But
sorry, just to interject for a second, I want to go back for a sec to the like this supposed divide between analytic and continental philosophy that you had mentioned, because like I find that really interesting too, because the more I learn about a lot of so-called continental philosophers, the more I realize, wow, a lot of these guys were actually rationalists, which is interesting, because before I learned about like idealism and continental philosophers, I suppose I just assumed that meant hardcore anti-materialism almost, like there's nothing physical that exists, it's all in the mind. But a lot of them, like I think it's I think it's Hegel, supposedly. I still haven't investigated his work much, but I've seen a lot of
Yeah,
lectures about his work, and I've read like people like Zizek who are Hegelians, and it seems like at least according to some philosophers, he was ultimately kind of a materialist, and he thought that there would be eventually some sort of materialist scientific explanation for things, but that the this would be the culmination of the evolution of the spirit, the ultimate achievements of science figuring out how the world works would be the culmination of the spirit evolving to understand itself, if I understand that correctly.
yeah. Anything you say by Hegel, you should say at the end, if I understand that correctly.
Yeah, of course.
Really, really hard. Hegel is the hardest philosopher. Derrida's a pussy compared to Hegel, if you
Oh
don't know.
yeah.
Hegel's very, very difficult, and I think, as with many great philosophers, you can read Hegel as an idealist, or you can read him as a materialist, and that's almost the definition of a great philosopher, isn't it? You can come at him from those things, or her from those angles. Yeah, I mean, Phenomenology of the Spirit, which is where Husserl got the name Phenomenology from, basically, is it almost reads like a novel where the human spirit does this great tour through human history, Western human history. He's not very good on non-white European history, basically. So does this great tour and ends up in a kind of congress with God, as it were. You know, the spirit finally attains its total form, and we're all perfect beings and all that sort of stuff. We're still waiting, obviously. So Hegel may still be proved right. It seems a little unlikely. But an absolutely fascinating thing of it, and yeah, just really fascinating on again that split that continues to occur in philosophy: idealism, materialism, and the other split, analytic and continental philosophy, which is a annoying. I find it increasingly annoying and want to try and heal it somehow, because it just seems that it's although I was reading a really interesting book by a guy called Gavin Maxwell, which is coming out next year. And it's about trying to integrate certain concepts. Grant Maxwell, trying to integrate certain concepts and trying to bring together stuff like analytic and continental philosophy. By stating the thing that's true of all philosophical disputes, isn't it? That if you look back at them in 100 years' time, you actually see the similarities rather than the differences. That the same questions were trying to be answered, and the disagreements were because they couldn't answer those questions. So that's an interesting thing. But for Husserl, that split didn't exist between the analytic and the continental. He invented continental philosophy to try and fix some of the problems with analytic philosophy, which I think both sides of the divide don't really notice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's really interesting how like that overlap that you see more and more. Like, I don't remember whether I mentioned this last time, but I was I think I did mention it last time. I was like more seriously reading some of Marx's work to see to investigate the boogeyman, so to speak. And
Right.
I noticed a few things like, whoa, he says he's like for the gold standard. That's like what libertarians say. And it also, what he says here and here makes it sound like he would be really favorable to Bitcoin too. A lot of libertarians like Bitcoin too, but a lot of them are super anti-Marx and think he would be totally against those things.
Yeah. I mean, Marx ultimately, he has been demonized a lot, and I think particularly demonized in the Anglosphere. Well, very much so in the United States, but elsewhere as well. His thing wasn't it, that he wants the best, the most good for the most amount of people, and therefore he was analyzing the capitalist system, which he thought didn't do that. Now, you may disagree with his answers, or you may agree with his answers and think that when they were put into practice they didn't work, or you may say they were never put into practice. But ultimately, that's what he's trying to do. Marx isn't coming along saying, I want to destroy the human race, which is the reputation he tends to have. He wants to, help people and make the maximum number of people happy. And so, all of those things, like, if Bitcoin worked and perhaps saved us all the labor of making money, then go for it, and then we can have a bit more relaxing time, which was a Marxist ideal, which hasn't quite been made to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one thing that's interesting too. Like in terms of Hegel, who we were talking about, that's another thing I find interesting about Slavoj Žižek, because one of the things, like, he's a super hard to understand philosopher too, but like as with a lot of these really abstract thinkers, the more the more lectures of theirs that you watch, and the more that you read of their work, the more you understand their worldview a little bit. And I think Slavoj Žižek has talked before about how he's a Marxist and a Hegelian, but he's more of a Hegelian than a Marxist, and which is interesting because even though Hegel preceded Marx, he wanted to put this kind of like Hegelian spin on Marx and recover more of the Hegel that Marx discarded, but still with like sort of a Marxist ideal, which I think is interesting. Like, I'm not a Marxist, but I understand, like, basically any political ideology usually has the idea of wanting to help people. That's one thing that's really important to understand, that like everyone probably has trouble with that from time to time. Like, how the hell can this person have this opinion about this? That seems to like defy reality. But it's really like like if you read the work of people like Jonathan Haidt, for example, you see that, people just with different political ideologies just have different fundamental psychological values from which we understand the world. Like, I understand, like, if I'm a conservative, I understand, I respect loyalty and honor more, and maybe if I'm a more liberal oriented person, I care more about like empathy and just helping oppressed people, rather than, maybe if you're more conservative oriented, like trying to help people to help themselves or something. Like, it really depends on what your values are. And sometimes it's really hard to understand how people can think that way, which is one of the things that I really appreciate about really complex philosophical thinkers like Husserl and Zizek and Hegel and Derrida and so many others, because they have some ideas that I disagree with for sure, but even with those ideas, they have such interesting perspectives on them that I've never heard of before, that they're so worthwhile to learn more about.
Yeah, absolutely, and they are these tremendous narratives for explaining the world, aren't they? And they can come completely from a strange angle. And also, I think part of the complexity, of course, is they're not wanting to make declarative statements, the sort of statements which are terrible in politics, for instance, where you say, I am right and this is wrong. They're often including the opposition, as it were, in their statements. They're particularly someone like Husserl, as I said. If you think of an objection to Husserl, he will be trying to answer it in a couple of pages further, because he's always thinking about these things. But so, great politics, of course, is bringing together parties who are opposed to each other. That's how great politics works. There's a quote by one of the Israeli presidents, and I can't remember which it is, and I apologize for that, but he was talking about Israel and said, the problem with making peace is you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And I think that's a really wonderful quote. That's the difficulty. You're someone you disagree with, you're having to find some common ground. And I think we've lost a lot of that, of course, haven't we? So to say the least. But back to Husserl, perhaps, who was not a political thinker at all. So we'll pop the politics to one side for a second, and kind of maybe have a bit of an exploration of phenomenology itself.
So I would love to go into any one of whichever one of these specific areas that you want to start with, or I could mention, like, I think I had a quote that sounded really fascinating from that Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page on Husserl's Phenomenology that you sent me, and I took a few notes. So How do you want to do that? Do you want me to ask you some specific questions that I have, or maybe dive into one of those specific aspects?
Well, maybe we'll just dive into the epoche, which you have there,
Okay.
Epoche, because that's kind of where I was just before when I was talking about Husserl had this fundamental insight, and I think it's a brilliant insight, that question of whether the world exists, it's in a sense a dead end. We can argue about it forever, but we're not going to know, basically. And so what Husserl said was, well, and this was his mathematical training to an extent, he said, well, let's bracket that question. Let's put it to one side. He called it the epoche, to put it to one side. That's an old Greek word for doing exactly that. Forget about whether the world exists. Okay, we might come back to that at some point. If other people want to go and look at that, go for your life. I'm not going to. What I want to do is look at how it feels to be in the world. Okay, so rather than going, okay, does this desk exist? I want to look at how it affects me, how it affects my consciousness that it exists. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. It's consciousness of this table. So how does that affect me? How do I view it? How does it smell? How does it look? How does it taste? If it's an apple, or if you want to taste the desk, why not? How do I get the image of the desk in my head? If I look at it from one angle, how do I know there's a back to the desk? How does sound work like that? If I hear a sound, how does it affect me? So for him, it was an experiential experience that he basically saw phenomenology and philosophy as description, that we have to continually describe the world, how we're affected by it, in order to understand consciousness. Consciousness has, in a sense, categories, essential things, and we can only get to those by describing the world. And this is a really fascinating thing that lots of thinkers have gone in very different directions with. One thing it does, and that perhaps Husserl wouldn't have picked up on this, although he edged towards it, was we get thinkers like Merleau-Ponty introducing the body into philosophy, and the body had been notoriously missed out in philosophy. From Descartes all about the mind, Kant all about the mind. People like Merleau-Ponty and Husserl a little bit took this idea, and a lot of feminist thinkers, the idea of how we're an embodied person. So in a very basic sense, when I'm looking at a table or whatever, I'm looking from, I'm about 6 foot tall, so just under 6 foot tall. Someone else who's looking from slightly lower down or slightly higher up will have a different experience. I'm a man. If I'm a woman, I have a different experience. If I'm, any of the different genders and so forth, I may have different experiences. If I'm blind, I have a different experience. So all of these worlds, you can't just say there's consciousness and world, and consciousness grabs the world and goes, that's it. All of these different ways of being affect how we take in the world, and therefore our subjectivity. And this is a really fascinating thing that comes out of Husserl, that our embodied experience is valid, where previous philosophers hadn't really looked at the body in that way. And it's obviously, when we talk about continental philosophy, a lot of it is about identity and who we are and how we're embodied. If you're strong, you have one take on the world. If you're weak, you have another. It sounds almost basic to us these days, but still in philosophy, it's something that's grappled with a lot.
Yeah, definitely. That's such a big divide in Western philosophy in general. Basically, just this idea of dualism that we were talking about before. That there's this essential divide between the body and the mind, but in reality, they're really the same thing. Like the mind is part of the body, and it's not one problem that I eventually noticed with dualism is that there's often this praise of the mind as being superior to the body, and this sort of puritanical mindset of, if you focus on your body and you enjoy things to do with your body, then that is for some reason inferior to intellectual pursuits that you do with your mind. And that is a more moral pursuit even.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that split it's in common language, isn't it? And in a lot of ways that we embrace the world. But it's also, I mean, for Husserl, and this is where Heidegger comes in and changes Husserl, takes phenomenology in another direction. But Husserl has this as well, that in many ways, our basic relationship with the world isn't conscious. And that's something that hadn't really been encountered by philosophy before, which thought consciousness was in charge. Hegel would say consciousness was in charge. Exactly the duality you're talking about: consciousness superior, the body inferior. But Heidegger, to take a Heideggerian example, Heidegger said, when you're opening a door, you're going through a door, you're going to a doorknob, turn the doorknob, go through the door, close the door behind you. According to a sort of Cartesian, Kantian, basically the whole history of philosophy up to then theory, you would walk towards the door, you would recognize it's a door, you would look at the doorknob, you would recognize it's a doorknob, think through how it functions, you would put out your hand is this independent thing apart from your body, apart from your mind, you would turn the doorknob, you would then think through other experiences of opening doors and so forth, pull the door open, go through the door, you would be in another space, and your mind would be sitting in your body, experiencing that space. You'd shut the door, all those things. We don't do that. We just walk up.
Yeah, we just do that automatically without even thinking of it.
The body does it. The mind is not involved in that process. While I was talking to you just then, I've done 50 things, right from my heart beating to moving my hands around to having a drink or whatever, none of which went through my consciousness at all. And Heidegger uses another great example, which is using a hammer. And I love this because he kind of tries to look at what philosophy has done, what philosophy is. He says, if you're using a hammer and you're hitting a nail and it's working perfectly, the other example is driving a car, it's working perfectly, bang, 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 you don't think about it. In a sense, the hammer becomes an extension of your body. You don't think about it. When the hammer goes wrong, you miss the nail, hit your finger, or if you're driving a car, when you crash the car, that is when you think about the hammer as an object in the world. That is when you start to do what philosophy does. People generally just live in the world and exist in the world and absolutely fine and don't think about it. When they do philosophy, they step back and start to treat the world as a series of objects. We don't actually do that in real life. And that was a huge part of Husserl's sort of leap forward in phenomenology, where he said philosophical thinking is valid and all of those things, but it's also a way of encountering the world which is not natural. It's valid because we want to work these problems out, but that's not actually how we encounter the world. And I'm not talking about sitting there thinking about philosophy and thinking about politics and so forth, but I'm talking about that move where philosophy says there are objects out there and there's a consciousness in here. That's what existence is. That's not how we experience the world. We do not do that. The world is part of us in some sense. And so that was kind of Husserl's other huge insight, that our existence within the world is the primary way we do that is through encounters with the world and through taking it on, but it's not treating it as an object. And certainly, and this was another thing that Husserl really grappled with and maybe got right, maybe got wrong, certainly we are not an object in the world. We never think of ourselves as objects in the world apart from when we're doing philosophy or, when we're getting ready for a date or, I know you do some weights. When you're doing a weight, you might look at your body and go, I put on this weight. These are the various circumstances, or people with diets and stuff. We think of the body as an object. Actually, we don't live the body as an object. We just are in the body and it does what it does most of the time without us really thinking about it. And that's a very powerful insight as well from Husserl, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like you were talking about, like that's how we inhabit the world. Like we inhabit the world like inside our bodies. Like it's not like we would be conscious of our place in the world, because we're not we're a separate part of the world, but we're existing within the world. So it's like that analogy of a fish swimming in water, like it feels natural. So it's not because you don't have anything else to compare it to, because that's your experience of living life.
Yeah, absolutely. And Husserl used the term life world for that. Sartre in particular ran with this board. Kind of, there's a great thing in his war diaries, Sartre's war diaries. Sartre, again, the whole French tradition is based on Husserl in many ways, and he talks about psychogeographies. It's just a journal, so he's just trying to list some things, and he talks about the fact that his neighbor's house is not close to him, because he doesn't encounter his neighbor. He doesn't know him. The place he used to go as a child is close to him, in his sensibility, because he has this connection with it. He thinks Paris is there because that's kind of his idea of direction, even though he knows it's geographically on the other side, and he thinks this is there because an ex-girlfriend lives there. And so you have this kind of encounter with the world. Our map of the world does not in any way map onto a folded map of the world, and we all have that, and that's a very Husserlian idea that what goes on in our encounters with the world, our experience of the world that we describe, doesn't have the sort of formal properties of a map or of philosophy, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I mean, the interesting thing about Husserl is from there's many interesting things. So from this kind of phenomenology, it was taken up by psychology, it was taken up by philosophy, it was taken up by Heidegger. And I've sort of discussed a little bit of how Heidegger did that. Heidegger essentially thought that Husserl was falling back into idealism somewhat, because Husserl is trying to say that there is no world unless I perceive it, as it were. Intentionality is always conscious of something. If I'm describing what I see and feel and hear, if I'm, it's almost like if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, doesn't make any noise. Husserl's almost saying, well, it doesn't, because it's irrelevant to our philosophical project, because I have to be there and describe the noise it makes when it falls. If there's no humans there, it's not part of the philosophical project, because I don't care whether the world exists. Heidegger wanted to really sort of bring the embodied self right down, and the example of the hammer is that, where he says, Husserl's still stuck on consciousness a bit. Husserl still can't let go of the Cartesian idea. In fact, Husserl wrote a late book called Cartesian Meditation, where he almost accuses himself of the same thing, that he can't let go of this idea of consciousness as the guiding thing. Heidegger thought consciousness was a mistake in lots of ways. There is an extreme position, which was not Heidegger's, but it fascinates me, called epiphenomenalism. And epiphenomenalism claims that that consciousness does nothing, that we have this little thing in our head that is basically along for the ride, and everything I'm doing now, everything I'm saying and so forth is just body doing it, and consciousness is just going, wow, I'm doing this, but it's not actually. Now that's kind of an extreme version of all of this.
Oh, okay, like the extreme in the other direction. Like there's nothing that we ever do consciously.
No, that's right. You were just stroking your chin unconsciously, I'm sure.
Right.
But also it would say everything you just said was unconscious, and every decision you make is already, your body has decided that. And if you're hungry, you'll eat something. You'll later think, well, I decided to have the tomato sandwich rather than cucumber sandwich. Actually, that was all going to happen. So that's an extreme version of it. Nothing that Heidegger would do, but it's trying to get away from that idea that consciousness is somehow in control. For Heidegger, he thought a minimal amount of our work in life is conscious. He thought a huge amount of it was unconscious, was reflex, was various things, the body going about things. And that he didn't say that as a bad thing. We shouldn't fall into the trap again of saying consciousness good, body bad. He thought that was just normal, and philosophy had failed to capture that, had failed to acknowledge that was actually the normal state of being, that we're not conscious all the time. You can do a little experiment, just after you finish watching this, just spend the next 5 or 10 minutes trying to be conscious of everything you're doing. You'll collapse in a screaming heap. It's impossible.
That reminds me too of this ideal or this idea in rationalism that's been applied to a lot of ideas in modern science, especially especially economics, for example. This idea that supposedly, quote unquote, man is a rational animal, but again, to go back to Jonathan Haidt, who's one of my favorite authors in terms of social and moral psychology, along with people like David Sloan Wilson and oh crap, I'm forgetting the last guy's names, but there are 3 main guys who talk about this a lot, but among many others, of course, that people don't behave rationally. We basically just start from our intuitions, and we just rationalize forward from our intuitions, and like you were saying, and like Heidegger says, we don't even do things consciously or for rational reasons most of the time. It takes a lot of work to do that because our prefrontal cortex is the newest part of our brain, so it's evolved for a shorter amount of time than the other parts of our brain that are not involved with thinking rationally and critical thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean that they talk about stuff like confirmation bias, don't they? That you're much more inclined to sort of believe something that suits you than you are to believe something that doesn't suit you, and all of those things. And I think that's a huge part of political theory now, isn't it? That we are guided much more by instinct than by anything else. And I think some people have been shocked by the kind of return to that in the last few years, where it does seem a much more instinctual sort of way of being in the world and way of being in politics. So these thinkers, from Husserl, and then you go through Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, Derrida, Foucault, Blanchot, all of these thinkers, they're kind of having taken this step of looking at how the world is constructed and how it goes on. Really have done a lot of fascinating work, and Continental philosophy, I think, stems from this kind of these original insights of Husserl, and continue to do so. And I guess the sort of area where Derrida comes in is Husserl had this idea of language. Basically, he, like so many philosophers, believed that the spoken word is better than the written word. That's in Plato, it's in Rousseau, it's in virtually every philosopher. They will say that the spoken word is closer to the truth.
Isn't like Socrates supposedly famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, for saying that the written word is going to corrupt people and make us all dumb because we won't remember anything anymore.
That's right, yeah. Which people say about Wikipedia and so forth now, don't they? That we won't remember anything.
Yeah.
So it's I've completely forgotten which of Plato's books it's in, and people will be yelling at the screen. But he, the written word is wrong for several reasons. It can escape us. Derrida was really fascinating this. When I write something down, it goes out of context and someone can read it completely wrong. So that's one thing. And Plato, through Socrates, describes it as something like the father is not there to look after it. This child goes out in the world and the father's not there. Now you can imagine psychoanalysts have had a lot of fun with that sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's that aspect of it. But it was also just seen as, well, I think it was Aristotle, I might be wrong. Aristotle basically draws up the scheme where he says you have the thought in your head, and that's pure and that's true and that's good. You then turn it into words in your mouth, and that's already slightly corrupted because it's not capturing things absolutely right, but it's not too bad. I, who's having the thought, then speak the words. You, who's listening to it, hear those words. You understand absolutely what I mean. All of the words make sense to you. They go into your ear. And then once it's in your ear, it goes into your brain, and the thought that I had here is transferred absolutely perfectly to your brain. So that's the ideal of language. You didn't say it always happened, or indeed maybe never happened, but that's the ideal. So everything that's not that is not as ideal. So again, if I have the thought in my head and rather than putting it into words, I then write it down rather than speaking it, I'm getting even further away from the soul. The soul, basically me talking is my soul talking in lots of ways. And so I'm corrupting it on a whole different level. So,
wow, that language of corrupting it is that's so moralistic.
Yeah, absolutely. There were some thinkers who Derrida had some massive arguments with, particularly a guy called Searle. But he was a disciple of Austin, and Derrida thought Austin was really interesting. Austin wrote a book called How to Do Things with Words, which is a really interesting title. So it's it looks at the way that words act in the world, rather than just being transparent conveyors of meaning. They can act. If I say, I declare you man and wife, I have, by those words, done an action. There's another example where if we're in a room and I say, gosh, it's cold in here, and you're sitting next to an open window, you know that is me telling you to shut the window, please. Okay, so words can do actions. That's an example of phatic speech, which isn't quite Austin, but it's still there or thereabouts. So they kind of, in order to have that, particularly Searle, they needed to think that language could be transparent in the same way that Socrates did. So they describe things like literature, theatre, jokes, I think most of language, as being corrupted. That it wasn't the pure thing. Me saying go and sit on that chair is pure language. It's understandable, explicable. That's language. Me saying, me telling a joke, isn't. It's a completely different thing. And Derrida had real problems with this because he thought all language did the same thing, basically. But just to go back a step, so this whole history of philosophy, basically, and it crops up in weird places, like Rousseau says that speech is better than writing, despite the fact that he says it while he's writing his confessions, which he says his confessions are the only things that the way he can speak his soul. Plato, who argues against writing down and argues against the poets and argues against theatre, sets everything he does up as dialogues. It's basically theatre and poetry and so on. And so, but for whatever reason, philosophers always come back to this thing that writing is worse than speech. And this is a huge part of Derrida, where Derrida tried to overturn that dialectic, that dichotomy. Sorry. So Husserl does it as well. Husserl says, you've got this pure thing in your mind and put it into words, no good. Put it into writing, worse. And Husserl actually goes so far as to say that actually the voice in your head that you're listening to now when we're not speaking, that voice is you. That's the pure soul. That's who you are. Now, there's various objections to that. When I'm speaking, in fact, and I may have said this in the last time we were talking, when I'm speaking, I'm not having the thoughts before I speak. I have no idea what I'm about to say next. I can speak absolutely cogently. I can stumble and fumble, but I can also speak absolutely cogently and say things like, I can speak absolutely cogently without at any time me thinking I can speak absolutely cogently as the next thing I'm thinking of. And of course, Freud has had lots to say about this sort of stuff. Most speech, we are just riffing. We're going. I find it very hard to actually think of a time when I've sat down, thought these are the words I'm going to say, and this is what I will say. Maybe giving a speech or something. And when we're having a conversation, you and I, we are taking each other to different places in conversation. I'm having thoughts I would not have if I wasn't talking to you. You're having thoughts you would not have if you weren't talking to me. I'm saying things like I'm having thoughts I would not have, which is a sentence I would never say unless we were having this conversation. So all of those things. So Husserl is wrong, but Derrida catches him out. Because in this book, Origin of Geometry, Husserl says something like, how do we make sure words keep their meaning? And he says, and it's one paragraph, and it's a very Derrida thing to do. We'll take a huge book and go, there's a paragraph that's really interesting because it contradicts the main thing that this guy says. And Husserl says, well, of course, the way we make sure that the word lion, he's talking about, big cats, the word lion, the way we keep the meaning of that is we write it down. And Derrida goes, aha, hang on. You've been saying that purity of language involves not writing it down. You've written this down.
Why did you write it down then?
Exactly. And the example I think Derrida gives, or maybe a secondary text of Derrida says, okay, so say I'm Einstein and I think of E equals mc squared. Okay, I've thought of it. Great thought. Terrific. So I tell a few of my mates, E equals mc squared. I show you the proof, blah, 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 describe it all for you. That's all great. But then I go to sleep, I forget it the next day, or I'm hit by a bus. A couple of other people I've told forget it. All of these things. E equals mc squared. If that's going to spread throughout the universe, there's only one way to do that, to write it down. And this is what science has always done. And this, of course, is what philosophy has always done. Philosophy, this great thing that's arguing against written word, has been written down. And for Derrida, this was kind of the eureka moment where he went, hang on, there is a massive contradiction here in Husserl. He didn't disrespect Husserl. He still thought Husserl was fantastic. And, Derrida still describes himself as a phenomenologist throughout his life. But he saw this massive contradiction that in fact, writing for Husserl in this paragraph, despite everything Husserl had said, was the way that meaning is guaranteed, was the way that meaning can be spread around. And he didn't, and for Derrida, there was no corruption that happens in writing that doesn't happen in speech. The whole thing about, that it can be taken out of context. We all know that can happen with speech, obviously. With, exactly the same as writing down. So that was one of Derrida's key insights. And, a lot of his work, particularly in the late 60s, was about the way that language, in a sense, was this idiot bastard child that ran around all over the place. And philosophers' attempts to pin it down were false, and that the way they were doing that falsely was the way they'd done a lot of things falsely, which brings us to kind of the metaphysics of presence, this trust that philosophy has that you can actually pin these things down and examine them in the way that science does. You can strap it down to a board, cut it apart, and look at it. And Derrida said, no, we're just thrown into the mess of life, and we have to try and, in Husserlian terms, describe it and keep describing it in lots of different ways, but never say that we've actually locked in that meaning.
Yeah. That's another idea that I've gotten really interested in too. Like it's so complex. Like language is so complex. It comes from so many different sources. There's so many different dialects depending on where you live, that you think you can come up with this fundamental theory of language and this is how language works, but it ultimately, like, I think both Derrida and Foucault talk about this a lot in their work, basically, that language evolves throughout history and the meaning of words change. So you're not going to be able to nail down one fundamental way that language is, because if you think that this is the way language works, then you can always find counter examples to that. And then maybe trends start to shift in a totally different direction from the way that maybe they were like 50 years ago. Who knows?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I do a lot of work editing, and one of the things I love is watching the way words come in and out of style. Like basic things, like if I edit something from 15 years ago, the word email is hyphenated, and now that hyphen's dropped away. So there's that. But also so that's kind of the actual putting together of the words. But these meanings do change. We all experience this. Words come in and out of fashion, don't they? At the moment there's great debates about the word literally. That literally should mean absolutely, but it actually is starting to mean its opposite, as it were. Which
especially if you're like a teenage girl.
Absolutely.
I'm literally dying right now. My friend wouldn't hang out with me and they went to the party without me.
Yeah, that's
I'm literally dying.
Yeah, which irritates the hell out of me, but also part of me goes, well, hang on, there's a few other, they're called Janus words. They're words where they have two opposite meanings. And I think in a couple of 100 years' time, people will be saying, oh, isn't literally a great Janus word? It means absolutely and also means not absolutely. It's I have this pet irritation that a lot of people in England hate Americanisms. They say, Americans with their, they call it fall and they rather than autumn, and they shorten words and they use well, there's a few things. One, it turns out most Americanisms are actually older English words that just haven't evolved, so they're actually closer to Shakespearean English, for instance, than English. But the people who argue it seem to be arguing that English should be the dominant language. And they say, America now, because America is this great empire, it gets to choose. It's too dominant. The reason English is the one that they like is because England had this great empire and imposed all this language on people years ago.
Exactly.
Words change by popularity, and at the moment, America is the biggest country and the biggest communicator, so words tend to go with them, and that will change a lot of times too. So, I mean, I just find language, the dynamic of language, absolutely fascinating and interesting. And we don't speak Shakespearean English anymore because it would be ridiculous. And in 200 years' time, what we're saying will probably appear incredibly verbose to the next generation. Will parts of consciousness be lost by doing that? I guess they will. Will other parts open up? I guess they will, because that tends to have been what's happened throughout history, isn't it?
that makes me think too about, like, for example, like the one form of language that's evolved since the creation of the internet and especially social media is like text speak or social media speech where you use all these acronyms that I try to avoid at all costs and they annoy me,
Yeah.
but occasionally I use them myself, like TBH, to be honest,
Right. Yeah.
or like
Absolutely.
I try to avoid those things. But the other day I said that, and I try to avoid saying things like lol and stuff like that. And like I have this same sort of mindset as the one that you were describing, like that maybe that like the English have against Americans, that this fucking text speak is so stupid and juvenile, like it's not
Yeah.
real language. Why do people talk that way? But
Yeah.
like it can be a good thing in some ways, and like there's not really necessarily a good reason for me to be all like purist about the way that I text people. Like
Right.
maybe if I'm writing a blog or something
Yeah.
like that, that makes a lot more sense to talk that way. And I'm just worried about like what you were saying earlier, like corrupting my ability to have good language by doing that in any form of communication. But
Yeah.
the like this makes me think about one thing that it's kind of like a thing specifically to do more with language, although this isn't the way that Foucault approached it specifically. But I was writing actually in a blog I was writing about Foucault and how the meaning of words change, and like in terms of his perspective on power, that
Mm.
he doesn't necessarily see power as an inherently bad thing. Yeah, power can be good depending on who is using it and how they are using it. So one example that I used of that a lot of people have used is black people and the N word. Like it used to predominantly be the like the N word with a hard R was a way for white people to be racist against black people,
Mm.
and that's still the case, but in society that's declined a hell of a lot. And then in a way that some black people have taken the power back from that word and repurposed it
Mm.
is like rappers, for example, using the N word without the hard R and using it as like an expression of like camaraderie and
Absolutely.
brotherhood and that kind of thing. It's like it can take on a different meaning
Mm.
depending on who is using it for and for what purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really fascinating example, isn't it? And this is one of the other things where I get irritated by people saying, my language is right, especially if it's kind of a particular type of English, that it language has been used to exclude people for a long time. It's been used to insult people, as in the N word. And insult is a light way of putting it. But also to exclude people. If you don't have the proper language, you can't get into certain things. You are excluded from this, that, and the other. I mean, I think it's a lot better now that you don't have to be able to speak posh, to use the English term, in order to get certain advantages. But there is still, I mean, one of the weird things for me as an Australian who lives in England is that I still can't quite get my head around the class system. But speaking to people who've grown up here, they will tell you as soon as someone speaks, you can tell where they're from, what sort of school they went to, all of these things because of their language. And I think here that I don't notice, but other people notice, there are people excluded from getting into universities, getting into schools, getting into jobs because of the way they speak, because of not even the words they use, but because of their accent and so forth. So that's a really interesting thing about language. So whenever I hear someone trying to sort of pin down language and say, this is correct, my immediate reaction is, well, it's correct for you, but also, whose advantage is it that this is correct? And that's Foucault is absolutely brilliant on that, isn't he? That I exert power by my language, and and we all do it unconsciously, but also inadvertently, don't we? We're talking about philosophy. If there's someone who perhaps hasn't looked at philosophy or whatever, they probably be bored out of their mind by this. But if we're at a dinner party with that person and they didn't know anything about philosophy, and we're getting overexcited and talking like this and using terms like phenomenology and Hegel and da 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 da, then we are excluding those people. And and it may not be their fault that they don't know this stuff, or they may be genuinely right that it's not interesting. Who knows? But there are ways of excluding, aren't there? Very, very much so. And so, but leaving all of that aside, I mean, for Derrida and most of the continental philosophers, what is fascinating here is that language continues to evolve and continues to move, and meanings, and therefore concepts, are all up for grabs. And that's kind of the opposition between the analytic school, which hopes to be able to say a concept is a particular thing, and we can get it there, and we can hold it there, and that's what it is, compared to the school which says it's going to change, it's still changing, it's made up, it's constructed, which is where sort of this Husserlian idea leads to your Derridas and your Foucaults and so on.
Yeah, exactly.
I did want to cover one other bit of what Derrida on Husserl before we
Sure.
end on those, which was the other kind of insight that Derrida had about Husserl was when we spoke way back an hour ago about Husserl talking about experiencing the world. So a table, you explore the world, you experience it, and you describe your experience of it. The big problem Husserl had, and he knew he had this problem, and he wrote books about this problem, was time. That time passes. In order to kind of fix the world, you have to, and again, with the Matrix is a great example here, in order to do what philosophers do to describe tables and books and all of these things, ideally you'd stop time and then you describe what was going on. Derrida didn't think that Husserl had solved this problem, and Derrida said the other problem with Husserl is he's always trying to find this vantage point from which to describe the world, and we're never in that vantage point. I'm moving my head around, so my vantages are changing. Our conversation is changing things. All of these things. Derrida said that was true of Husserl, but then, and this is where Derrida becomes Derrida in a sense, deconstruction is born from this. He says that's true of all philosophy. All philosophers had this idea he called the metaphysics of presence, that somehow you can stop all this stuff going on and get to a genuine understanding, a genuine truth that can be described, by a philosopher. And eventually we'll get to the end of time, we'll get to the Hegelian spirit, and everything will be explicable. And Derrida said that most philosophical writers writing kind of focus on trust. It's hidden within their philosophy that eventually they believe the problems can be solved. And that made the way that they wrote and the things that they wrote about be of a certain type. And in fact, if you take away that and just go through a message, then things will be. And I was reading Plato the other day, and he said in one thing, just a remark, he said, actually, the world's really, really messy. And when you try and sum everything up, there's always a little bit that you can't get to. And that's Derrida. That's absolutely Derrida's point. That once you fix everything in place, there's still this little bit that you can't get to. And yeah, if you want to understand Derrida, that's it, basically.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like I love all this connection. That's one thing I love about learning about philosophy in general. Like the more you learn about specific philosophers, the more you realize they talk about other philosophers that you've heard of, and then you can connect all of these ideas and sort of trace the lineage of different ideas between them, like you did with Husserl through Derrida there. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any other like specific aspects of Husserl on phenomenology, or any of the ones I had on the screen there that you wanted to get into, or did you want to get into maybe a few of the notes or the quote that I had or something? What do you want?
Yeah, I guess perhaps I think intersubjectivity is an interesting one because it's something that I've grappled with. So I think maybe we'll do that, and then maybe we'll finish with me talking a little bit about Husserl's later life.
Sure.
I think it is fascinating. The intersubjectivity presents a bit of a problem for Husserl, as it's presented for all philosophers, in that if my consciousness is encountering the world, how and in a sense constructing the world, when he talks about the life world, things start to exist because I am conscious of them. How does that affect me in terms of other people? and it's in a sense the old other minds problem. How can I think any other people have minds? Maybe they're all robots, automatons, and science fiction has done this a lot, and it is a big problem for him. This kind of idea of how we create things. He sort of fudged things. I think he sort of said, obviously there's other minds because we'd all go mad if there wasn't. And the way our life world is constructed is by kind of agreement with each other. We all agree that this is a table, and we'll continue to call it a table. And that, in fact, is why it's a table, because enough people, the majority of people, he might even say all people, but let's go with the majority, say that it's a table. So that's kind of how he fudged intersubjectivity, and not necessarily successfully. I think a more interesting take on this is another follower of Husserl who studied under Husserl, who's a guy called Levinas. A huge influence on Derrida, particularly Derrida's ethics. But also Levinas had this insight where he said, okay, so Husserl says we're encountering objects in the world. What objects in the world do we encounter that's absolutely radically different to everything else? And Levinas said, another human. In fact, he said, another human face. When I encounter a face, all of the stuff that Husserl says about me, describing and so forth, is blown out of the water. Encountering a face is this incredible experience. And he actually just calls it face in the end. What we do is face. And he has this, I talked about the lighthouse earlier, this idea of Descartes, the consciousness in and consciousness going out. Levinas actually said that our entire subjectivity is based on encounters with the other. So you can't have a subject without another subject, without another human being. So it is not until I encounter another human being that I actually become a subject. And I encounter a lot of other human beings, and they give me my words, they give me my feelings, they give me my emotions, they give me love, or they give me hate, or they give me all these things. My actual being is built out of encounters with the other. Other has a capital O. And I think it's a really fascinating sort of way to take Husserl down to another place where it's sort of saying it's anti-Cartesianism, as it were. You could, if my consciousness was floating in space or in a vat, as we said before, it would be absolutely radically different to what I have now. And the reason it would be absolutely radically different is A, because the world wouldn't be there, but B, because I wouldn't encounter others. So no language, no thoughts, no emotions, none of those things. So to even call it consciousness is false. So what we have is constructed by our encounters with the other, from our birth through to our death. And I think that's a really fascinating thing. And psychoanalysts and psychologists have obviously run with that, things about loneliness and things about absence and things about the breakdown of the self where it's not encountering others. I think these ideas have become quite familiar to us that, if you're not encountering other people, you do internalize that. And people who have schizophrenia, and for instance, it's a real, because they're not individuating in that way, and symbol formation and so forth. So I think it's a really fascinating place. If you like a beautiful read in philosophy, then Levinas is very beautiful and difficult, but beautiful. So
yeah, a lot of the philosophers we've mentioned are like that, like Levinas and like Foucault and Derrida especially.
Yeah, beautiful reads in many ways. So but yeah, I just think the other reason I have this kind of love for Husserl, this affection for Husserl, was because his life did take a tragic turn, in the way that it did for many Jews in the 1930s and 40s who lived in Germany. Husserl, he was born Jewish. He actually converted when he got married to Protestantism, particular type. He and his wife. He's in his early 20s. He lived to be close to 80. So for 50, 60 years, and was very proud of his achievements. He was a well-respected professor, seen by some as a philosophical genius, very much an establishment figure, very much your kind of idea of the Germany of the 20s and 30s with the red draped curtains and the big heavy desk and the students coming and spending time with him. His student Heidegger, as many may know, during the Nazi Party. And for Husserl, this was an incredible betrayal because Heidegger was seen as his most brilliant student and was his most brilliant student. I mean, Heidegger is one of the great philosophers of all time. So, yes, he was a great student. Heidegger's philosophy moved away from Husserl's philosophy in lots of ways, which was quite hurtful to Husserl. But also, Husserl lost all his rights as a Jew. It didn't matter that he'd been non-Jewish for 60 years, if you want to call it that. And he was cast out of the university. He couldn't borrow books anymore. He lost his job. He lost all of these things. In a sense, fortunately, he died before he was taken to a death camp. Because he would have been, his wife also died. So again, that was all right. But a lot of people around him were fleeing or dying. He saw himself as incredibly German and, traditional German person. And it's a really sort of, I find it quite moving when you read about his sort of last days. He's desperately trying to get all his writings done. He's feeling absolutely betrayed by Heidegger. Heidegger is giving speeches about, being a Nazi and how great that is and how terrible the Jews are. And Husserl is broken by this. And, his last few years, he had to move the house he stayed in for, the last 50 years of his life. And I just think that there's a real sort of, there's a narrative arc of Husserl from this mathematical prodigy, trying to pin the butterfly of mathematics to this inventor of a great philosophy that continues to be incredibly influential. It's this kind of tragic figure who dies not alone or anything like that, but dies thinking all these things he's fought for, truth, justice, all of those things are being swept away. And his last book, The Crisis of European Science, in a sense, he's just looking at science, that science doesn't quite relate to the world as it should now. But it's also, he really thought the world was wounded. He thought the world had gone bad. And he felt that philosophers, in some sense, were responsible for that, because one of the jobs of philosophers is to identify these problems and to stop what is happening. And I think for many of us living in this era where we've seen kind of belligerent politics and been surprised by people being able to shout and have great followers, that was what he was going through too, this kind of great irrationality, this man who dedicated himself to being rational in his sense, this great irrational upsurge of hatred that he was caught up in. And really fascinating figure. And there is on YouTube the one video of Husserl that exists, and he's in his garden and it's a sunny day and he looks happy and terrific and all of these things. But the story of that particular time was incredibly tragic, and he was really only just holding it together. And so that's a very beautiful, tragic, and moving thing about him, I think.
Oh wow, yeah, I didn't know that about him. Wow, that is very interesting and also tragic about him. That was me what you were saying about in terms of Husserl and Heidegger was make me think about that sort of general principle that we were talking about earlier about how people who supposedly are evil or have like really renegade or terrible thoughts that people look down on, like Marx, for example, or like it reminds me of how in terms of Heidegger, it reminds me of how investigating Marx more and different Marxists like Slavoj Žižek and David Harvey, for example, and others like that they have really interesting ideas, even if I fundamentally disagree with them on some points. And you could say the same thing about Heidegger too. Like obviously that it's terrible that Husserl had to go through that, and that Heidegger never came through even for his best student in terms of that. And of course he's known for being a supporter of the Nazi Party, but like I always knew that when I've investigated his philosophy a little bit. And the thing that's interesting too is that he has such interesting philosophical ideas that in which he never mentions anything about Nazism or anything like that, like in terms of his Dasein and being, and this idea of his examination of the idea of nothing and the nothing, and what he talks about in terms of ideas like that are really fascinating in some similar ways as some of these continental philosophers like Husserl and Hegel and Derrida and others.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, we could talk about Heidegger for another hour and a half, couldn't we? I mean, he's an incredibly interesting thinker, and I think a bit of an asshole as a person.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Everything you read about him, he's just he's a bit of a prick. But there's a really interesting. So we won't go on too much longer, but there's a really interesting book that Derrida wrote about Heidegger called Off Spirit. And what we were talking about.
I'd be interested to read that. Actually, I'm going to make a note of that.
Okay. What we were talking about before, the idea of the materialist take or the kind of idealist take. The word spirit, of course, is a hugely influential word in German philosophy. And again, this is Hegel, Phenomenology of the Spirit. German philosophers worry about the spirit, what it is, what it does, and so forth. Heidegger, in his early work, and again in his later work, but let's concentrate on early, wants to get rid of the idea of spirit. He actually says something in very early in Being and Time, saying this idea of spirit has buggered us up. Basically, it's screwed around with us. Let's put spirit to one side and let's talk about hammers, nails, doorknobs, that sort of stuff, the material world. In a similar way that Marx did, in fact. There's not too many things which brings Marx and Heidegger together, but in that, the material world, that's what we're concentrating on. And in Of Spirit, Derrida analyzes Heidegger's notorious rectorship address. Heidegger was made rector of a university and does this great thing about, the spirit of the National Socialists will carry the university into the future. And it's the most Nazi thing you can possibly read, basically. But where Derrida does this beautiful thing where he talks about in Being and Time, the word spirit always has quotation marks around it. We must get rid of spirit must go. And Derrida describes it as like the theatre curtains have been thrown up, that the word spirit in the rectorship address has no quotation marks and has a capital S. So suddenly this thing which Heidegger was trying to get rid of, was embarrassed by, this word that he had to put in quotation marks, suddenly becomes this huge word in his Nazi notions. And yeah, it's a great piece of writing by Derrida. But also, I mean, it was an awful thing that Heidegger became involved in. It is quite hard then to extract some of his later thinking from it. I think his later thinking is, again, beautiful and moving. He talks about poetry and the earth, and we again have turned everything into objects. We shouldn't be objects. It should be this communion with the earth. And then you think, well, in a sense, that again is what the fascists were thinking. So, I kind of, if he hadn't been a fascist or a Nazi, you wouldn't think that about this stuff, but he was, and therefore it takes on all that. And in my more generous moments, I just think that Heidegger was a bit of an asshole. He got caught up in the situation that he got a promotion, great. Everyone loved him, great. And he thought that most of philosophy was wrong, so this is a great regeneration. And if the regeneration has to be National Socialism, well, I'll go with that regeneration, whatever. That's me being my most generous to him. At my least generous to him, I think about the fact that he didn't go to Husserl's funeral. He pretended he had a cold, basically, and that for me is very Heidegger.
Oh yeah.
So yeah.
Good. Like a lot of philosophers. I mean, not to ignore any of the terrible things that Heidegger said or did, of course, but a lot of philosophers are notorious for having had a lot of mental problems and having had some very strange ideas and ultimately terrible ideas, like for example, it was Aristotle who was like really misogynistic, and he was pro-slavery, which was super popular at the time, which doesn't mean that it wasn't wrong, but he still he still had lots of ideas, interesting ideas, in spite of those awful things too.
Yeah, well, it's basically, philosophy is a bit of a weird thing to do, isn't it? So you're probably not going to be your general normal person doing it, I guess. My favorite little anecdote about Aristotle is there's a section of his where he talks about the fact that men have more teeth than women. And he argues this from philosophical terms, and never at any point does it occur to him to go and actually count the teeth of his wife, for instance.
Oh, that's funny.
Sums up a particular way of doing philosophy, I think.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Terrific. So I know you said you wanted to end it soon there.
Yeah.
I just wanted to before we end it there. I think now that we've talked about Husserl more, I think there is a. Oh yeah, it's this one. I want to read this because we basically. Actually, no, I just want to read two quotes here, one shorter one and one longer one. And I think this is a good place to do this at the end because it'll help us, or it'll help people understand this a little better. I thought this quote was really interesting. If one is hallucinating, there is really no object of perception. However, phenomenologically, the experience one undergoes is exactly the same as if one were successfully perceiving an external object. So that kind of relates back to what we were saying about reality and whether you're a brain in the vat or like you're in the matrix or something like that. If you are hallucinating in your experience, it's the same thing as having a real experience.
That's right. Yep. And it comes back to that thing we talked about right at the start, wasn't it? That for Husserl, the question of whether the world exists or not, let's put that to one side. So if you're having that experience, let's not just get into debate about whether it's a real experience or not, because it's not worth it. You are actually having that experience. And I think Husserl has been, I have people who work in psychological fields and so forth, and Husserl has been very influential in that because it allows you to regard someone's experience as valid. Even if they're having a psychotic episode, you don't just say they're wrong. You try and incorporate in your response to that their reality. So Husserl was fascinated by dreams and hallucinations and so forth because he thought that was what that told us something about the human brain and human being.
Yeah, for sure. So let me just read this just slightly longer quote here too, which I think is also really interesting. It's a little confusing, but it's more understandable given some of what we've already talked about. Okay. So even the objective spatio-temporal world, which represents a significant part of our everyday life world, is constituted intersubjectively, says Husserl. The same holds true for the spatio-temporal framework consisting of objective time and space. Husserl starts again from a first-person viewpoint, from a quote-unquote solipsistic abstraction of the notion of a spatio-temporal object, which differs from that notion in that it does not presuppose that any other subject can observe such an object from his or her own perspective. His question is what justifies us, i.e., in each of him or herself, in the assumption of an objective reality consisting of such objects, giving only this quote-unquote solipsistic conception of a spatio-temporal thing or event as our starting point. On Husserl's view, the crucial further step in order to answer this question consists in disclosing the dimension that opens up when the epistemic justification or motivation of intersubjective experience or empathy is additionally taken into account and made explicit. So that's like really, really abstract and complex there.
Pretty catchy stuff, isn't it? Often.
Yeah.
I mean, what it's saying basically, isn't it, that the first sentence of Husserl does the Cartesian thing, that, I am a consciousness, I encounter this spatio-temporal object, again, let's call it a table, and that's how I encounter it. But then Husserl, and this is Husserl's grapple right throughout to try and not be Cartesian, then takes the extra step and says, actually, you need a second person there. If you don't have the second person there, then there is no table. I cannot be an independent person encountering a table just absolutely purely. Now, the second person doesn't actually have to be there with me. Obviously, I've encountered a lot of people who have told me this is a table, and we've all agreed it's a table. So next time I go into an empty room by myself and I see that object there, I'll be able to go, that's a table. But had I never met all of those people and never been through all those experiences, my spatio-temporal world would be completely batshit crazy. I wouldn't understand what's going on. I'd see that thing and it would blow my mind. And that's not what happens. So therefore, intersubjectivity works.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Oh man, this is Husserl is such an interesting thinker. You really convinced me to look into his work and read more of it.
Yeah, I'll just say, for me, I know there's a lot of people who don't find much pleasure in Husserl, and they're probably valid. But I really, really, really do like the way that he will go, okay, what's it like to look at a table? And you will have 80 pages where he tries to work out what it's like. And some of those things are obvious, but some of those things are not obvious. And he really just thinks and thinks and thinks. And if you want to encounter just someone thinking really, really hard, as opposed to some of those philosophers who make grand statements, or as opposed to philosophers who have a barrier to push, or as opposed to those philosophers who aren't quite as good as Husserl, if you just want to experience another mind thinking, and then going, no, I'm wrong. Hang on, let me start again. No, hang on. Most of his books actually had the subtitle "An Introduction to Phenomenology" because he was starting again. He just kept starting again. And in fact, on his deathbed, and this is a perfect place to end it, on his deathbed, he said, "It's such a shame I'm going to die because I wanted to start again." And brilliant.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I love that.
Terrific.
Okay, well, yeah, we can end it there if you want to.
Fantastic.
So
Thank you all
yeah, thanks.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for talking with me again. I love doing like deep dives into philosophy like this. I don't have that many people to talk to about this kind of stuff, and I love like making my own videos and reading and researching about it and talking about people with it, or talking with people about it as often as I can. And I was thinking also maybe you would be interested in talking again sometime about critical race theory, because I saw that you had tweeted about that, and how if you investigate the actual underlying philosophy of it, it sounds kind of like the situation similar to so-called postmodernism, where people like haven't actually read the origins of what they're talking about here, and they get it all wrong. I was thinking about that because one of my friends actually recently read one of the original texts by one of the so-called critical race theorists, and it originated just as a legal theory to have arguments based on like the historical oppression of people in court, and use that as a legal argument. And he was saying there's none of this stuff in this book about how black people can't be racist, and like we should basically make everything like talk about race constantly, and all this crazy like wokeness stuff that people are talking about, and how so I would like to like learn more about that and kind of discuss that at some point if you'd be interested, and maybe even also include my friend who was reading that book and was telling me about that if you're interested.
Yeah, absolutely. I in fact just yesterday wrote an incredibly long ranty email about critical race theory, the attacks on critical race theory, which I just think are propaganda. Basically, I think they're a bunch of lies because they don't like black people having their identity supported. I think it's as simple as that. So obviously we'll stretch that out over a bit longer and investigate some of the issues. But yeah, I think the attacks on critical race theory are racist and terrible, and they need to be exposed. So let's have a go at doing that.
All right, cool. Yeah, if you could recommend to me, just send me a message of like anything that you would recommend in particular for me to read based on that, to educate myself more about it, because then I can have a more informed discussion about it.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic.
So, all right. So yeah, thanks. That's awesome. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, great.
Thanks so much again for talking with me.
No worries. And thank you for everyone who's watching out there. And
Yeah.
and we'll see you again soon.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks again so much to everyone for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Click that like button. Click the bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Probably doing a movie chat. Yes, get Peter Salmon's book, An Event Perhaps, Biography of Jacques Derrida.
I'm supposed to do that at the start, really.
Definitely.
I don't know if it was any
Read,
good.
I think I added in the description, like I did in our last episode, a link to your book, and also a link to that article that you wrote about postmodernist philosophers and public intellectuals that got us talking in the first place.
Perfect. Great.
And so like I always say at the end of these, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And learn more about philosophy. It's fascinating. All right. Thanks again, everyone. And adios until next time.